And just so you all know, to say again, the title for this presentation is Going Far by Going Together, Building a Network of Food System Networks. And so this is the last in our series from our action teams. And we will be having the last webinar in June. But if you go to the next slide, Dawn, just to give you a little bit of overview about this project. This project is in the second year of its efforts, and it's really meant about looking to enrich and expand efforts across the local regional food system. And that first year was really in response to the COVID pandemic and the challenges that were faced across the food system as a result. But the second year that we're in is really thinking about how do we take some of those key lessons and ideas that were experienced from that incredible disruption to our food system to think towards the future to creating a resilient and equitable food system. And so what we're doing is we're documenting and disseminating innovation across sectors. And it's really important to think about how, rather than getting us in these silos of our sectoral spaces, to think about what are the opportunities to build bridges across these sectors, recognizing that there's more resiliency if we work together. And the team, I work with a fabulous team comprised of multiple agencies, multiple sectors. We've got 8 communities of practice that help us with our work to make sure that it is grounded and reflective of the realities that people are facing on the ground. We've also got a cooperative agreement with the USDA AMS, and it's a partnership between the University of Kentucky as well as Colorado State University is working with us on this. Next slide. And so when we think about the idea of creating cross-sectoral collaboration, thinking about how diverse and expansive our food system is, we try to think about how to organize that into workable sections. And so what we ended up doing was breaking out the work into 3 different action teams. There's the data and metrics, and we heard from them a few months ago. And they're really looking at creating a centralized location to ease the access and utilization of data from both secondary sources from the federal government, local governments, county, state, those kind of things, as well as recognizing that our communities on the ground are collecting information about the places and the work that they're doing and trying to make those more readily accessible to people across the food system, across the country, seeing that we have lessons to learn and that trying to quickly communicate the impact of that work is important, and that historically some of our federal data sets have done not as good of a job as they could to engage and quantify and consider the challenges that are faced by communities that have historically been underrepresented and overlooked. So how can we work with those folks that are working with those communities and bring those stories and ideas and data closer to the surface so that we can make sure that we're including those groups? We also have the Resiliency Playbook, and they're bringing together folks from across the food system that have been dealing with significant disruptions, be they wildfires, hurricanes, other interruptions, and thinking about how communities have come together to work and create tools and resources to respond to those challenges. And so they're creating the Resiliency Playbook, and that's also including a lot of the incredible resources and tools that came out of the first year, and trying to think about how do we make these more applicable and increase the utilization for a wider array, not just a public health pandemic situation. And finally, we have the Network of Networks. And so that's what this presentation is all about. And so the Network of Networks is the idea that if we bring together and convene individuals that represent multiple different stakeholders across a large geographic area, that there's value to be gained by building those networks in times of relative stability, because having those relationships and ties make it so much easier to respond to a disaster or disruption in the future. And realizing that there's so much learning that can happen across these organizations, and to really create a dialogue between the people that are on the ground, folks that are kind of convening those works across larger geographic areas, and funders and other organizations. and universities as well. And so that's what this is really the foundation of this conversation that we'll be having today with our speakers. And so, Dawn, you can close out the PowerPoint slides. But before we start this conversation with our speakers, and I'll let our speakers introduce themselves, I want to pose a question to all of you. And this is really an invitation to have a conversation. One of the things, if you've been part of our webinars in the past, is that our chat box is really meant to be a conversation dialogue space. So if something comes to mind while you're listening, or if you have a question, please post that in the chat. Or better yet, if you have a resource that answers somebody else's question or provides some kind of insight or guidance to the conversation that we're having, please put that link or idea into the chat, and we'll be sure to capture those ideas and concepts in our webinar summary. So on our website, and Dawn, if you could post the link to the webinar page. After each of these webinars, we post the recording of the webinar that can be shared, but we also write up a 3 to 5 page summary of all of the ideas and concepts that were shared in that webinar. And then we also post links to different resources and tools that came out of the conversation. So with that being said, I want to pose this question to the group, is where do you see the edge of the work that you're doing? So right now we're on the ground doing the work. Where is that edge? And what is just on the other side of that fringe of possibility? And what, with a little bit of increased capacity, support, money, research, could you actually accomplish and reach that goal? So these are just some ideas and questions that I want to plant in your back of your mind as we're having these conversations. It's like, if you just had one more connection and one more relationship or another partner at the table, what do you think you could accomplish? And what would that relationship kind of look like? So with that, I'm just going to let that kind of seep in and hang out, and I'll post it in the chat as well. But I will ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves and their organization and a current issue or motivation or opportunity that you're working on. So Dave, why don't you start us off?
Great. Thanks, Libby. Hi, everyone. My name is Dave Nezzi. I'm here on behalf of the Thornburg Foundation. It's a private family foundation based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I serve as the Food and Agricultural Policy Officer for the foundation. And what we're currently working on right now is I think we're doing an evaluation on our strategic initiative, and so there's a lot of moving parts in this and planning, working with our various stakeholders, and just trying to re-envision, what the future of our initiative is going to look like. So that's certainly keeping us busy. Thanks.
Colleen.
Everyone, my name is Colleen McKinney. I am with the Center for Good Food Purchasing. We're a national nonprofit organization that works with community-based and national organizations, institutions, and policymakers to advance social and environmental values as a driver for institutional food procurement decision-making. So, one thing that we work on is operating the Good Food Purchasing Program, which is our flagship program. It's a metric-based framework to help encourage and measure progress toward goals in local economies, environmental sustainability, labor, animal welfare, and health and nutrition. So we're currently operating in over 60 institutions in 24 cities across the country and impacting over $1 billion in food spend through commitments to these values. And across the country, community-based coalitions have campaigned for and won 15 policy adoptions in public institutions that commit to these goals. So we're always working to accelerate the values through those mechanisms.
Eli, are you back with us?
Yes, I think so. Apologies in advance if I'm having issues with the audio, but hopefully it's coming through. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eli Moy, and I'm a Bloomberg Assistant Professor of American Health and also faculty in the Department of International Health at Johns Hopkins. A current issue I am working on focuses on really generating opportunities for cross-sector integrated solutions, specifically across food systems, urban planning, and public health. So just to give a little bit of context for my work, a lot of planning decisions, whether explicit or implicit, really shape our food systems, from land use to transportation infrastructures to economic development. And yet a national survey of planning practitioners in 2008 found less than 1% of planners explicitly integrating food into official plans. And so my work in food systems planning is about creating these opportunities to strengthen networks across these sectors, specifically leveraging planning tools, processes, and policies to strengthen our local and regional food systems.
And Eli, we're still having some issues with your audio. It's coming okay with mine, but it seems like some other folks are still having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, got it. I'll try to troubleshoot on my end. Thanks.
Okay. And so thank you all for those introductions. I think it's always so much better to have you all do it rather than me reading out your bios. So some people are hearing, some people aren't. I'm not really sure what's going on. I'm just going to blame everything on Friday 13th today. Like, that's just going to be my mantra for the day. So I really appreciate that we have an individual kind of representing the funding, an individual representing kind of this broader network across multiple actors that are working towards a common goal. And then we also have a representative from the university system as a possible partner in research. So building off of that theme, I would like each of you to kind of speak to a story of a process of working with a partner across multiple stakeholder groups. And what does that look like for you in the past? So I'm going to start with Colleen, if you can speak to that, about working with these partners across sectors, and how has that helped you to go further together?
Yeah, so for the Good Food Purchasing Program, cross-sectoral relationships and partnerships are really at the heart of helping the framework that we have meet its real potential. So we work with hundreds of national and community-based good food purchasing coalitions that are comprised of community groups in the cities and regions we're working in, policymakers, funders, and institutions across the country. And we've done that over the last decade. And I think one thing that we felt really lucky to witness was the power of those partnerships at work during, COVID response, when those cross-sectoral relationships contributed toward rapid response efforts and development of new policy agendas coming out of the lessons learned. And one thing I wanted to just lift up was that we documented and what we observed and took away from that across our network in a guiding vision called the Roadmap for the Post-Pandemic Food System that we need. And I'll drop the link to that in the chat at some point here. But in that document, we highlight 4 pillars for food system transformation that we saw coming together through the work that our partners and our network were doing. And one of those pillars was the criticality of cross-sectoral partnerships for accelerating food system transformation through institutional food procurement. And I think just more generally, one example that comes to mind when we talk about the importance and power of cross-sectoral partnerships is around a specific tension point in our program, which is perceptions and realities around higher costs for good food. So we, as I mentioned, working with coalition partners to advance campaigns to win policy adoption of Good Food Purchasing Program commitments at institutions. The first question is always around how won't good food cost more, and how are we going to afford to do this within our budget? So I think unpacking that question helps institutions set concrete strategies to advance values-based procurement in the short term around cost-neutral menu planning and product substitution strategies. But we know that can only go so far. And so also that, going through that conversation gives coalitions targeted policy and budget advocacy priorities that are really grounded in meeting the goals of the community, and then opens up opportunities for public and private investment and policy change through advocacy that creates the longer term opportunities to really leverage institutional procurement change for the greatest possible food system impact. And so when we institutions work through to advance a number of creative and innovative approaches around cost management, but we've also, with our partners, been on a journey to really understand more about the gap between what institutions can pay for food within their existing constraints and then the true value of good food when we account for the externalized cost to workers and eaters and farmers, fishers, and ranchers, animals, and our earth, to really inform what those longer term policy priorities can look like. So one example of this that I wanted to highlight was just how we've learned from institutions who are trying to sort of advance values and use this framework that we're offering in partnership with our community partners about what the per meal budget increases that they would need to really do something more transformative around advancing these values. So one example is from Austin Independent School District, where they saw how they were performing on the metrics in our program and determined that an additional 25 cents per meal would allow them to source 10% of their food locally, at least 5% with small and historically disadvantaged producers in their region, 5% from organic producers, and 10% from fair and humane producers. So these sorts of impacts were highlighted in a recent school meals case study we collaborated on with the Rockefeller Foundation, which took a methodology that they developed around the true cost accounting for food and extended that out to the National School Meals Program at large. And our team was invited to work with them to apply that framework to a case study where we quantified the financial benefit of the current USDA school meals program and what additional benefits could occur if tweaks to the program were made. So basically taking this case study of Austin and expanding it out to the full meals program, and through that calculated that if shifts were made to 30% of the school meals spend nationally to align with values, the program could support almost $1 billion in wages from local jobs related to local purchasing, $234 million in reduced greenhouse gas emissions from reducing conventionally raised beef, and a decrease of 567,000 pounds of pesticides on 46,000 acres of farmland from replacing conventional with USDA or organic for the most commonly purchased produce items in the school meals program. So all of this is to say that this type of research and data that's grounded in the current realities that institutions that we're working directly with are operating in can and is actively supporting advocacy and policy priority setting for local, state, and federal policy to really support institutions to meet the demands of their community to pay for the true value of good food in public and school district settings. So that's what I'm really excited about, the opportunities that we're seeing emerging out of that kind of connection and analysis.
That's wonderful. And I feel, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I talk to some of my other friends in other sectors and I start talking about the numbers in terms of the economic impact or the funds that are out there funneled into local and regional food systems, sometimes I can feel a little small. And so hearing you even just throw out billion, like that gets us to another level and another scale that I think many of us might be, because of our focus in our communities, might not necessarily think that big as what is the potential if we really put some resources and energy behind this and think about it kind of across a larger scale. So I think that's wonderful. And I really appreciate that story in the Austin School District and taking this one example and kind of expanding it across. Dave, why don't we turn to you and find out what's happening in New Mexico? And if you could share a story of a process that's in your state about how these different stakeholders came together to have real impact and change in their place.
Yeah, absolutely. So several years ago, actually, food policy has been going on in New Mexico for several decades, but years ago, about 2016, the foundation and a few other funders in the state collaborated together And, recognizing that in our state, we have an aging workforce. We have, a changing climate, which is reducing our water availability. We are losing agricultural land loss in some of our, urban areas that are starting to become more populated. And we needed to find a way to bring stakeholders together to strategize on how to make the food system more resilient. And so back in 2016, we were able to publish a New Mexico Agricultural Resilience Plan with our partners at New Mexico First, who did some regional stakeholder forums across the state and was able to get a lot of feedback from, producers, ranchers, processors, pretty much everybody along the food chain or the food system. And so getting all that feedback and putting it into a plan that identified some policy initiatives that would then be pushed hopefully through, the state policy. And after those regional forums, a task force was initiated, and that task force then again identified some of the priorities. And since then, we've been funding New Mexico First to continue these convenings because of the power of convening. I mean, it's just it's absolute. And so during these convenings, people are able to, again, talk about where are the gaps and what do we still need to move forward. And I think the most recent example of the accomplishments from that ag plan just happened in this past legislative session, where the state appropriated $24.5 million for food and agricultural initiatives. It's a huge number. The first time, it's unprecedented for New Mexico, but it's really going to change the landscape, we hope, by increasing local production here in the state and creating a more resilient workforce. And so that was something that we've done just to help. And again, it was a combination of various funders and all these stakeholders putting in their input.
Dave, I really appreciate that you're talking that it's an ongoing effort. It's not one and done, or you feel like you've made it to the finish line and you can take a break. So I think that ongoing conversation and the intentionality about convening people to maintain those relationships is really important. No. Eli, do you have a story or an example of folks coming together to work on a project from the past?
Yeah, so we're actually in the midst of our story, if you will. But I thought I'd share, from the researcher perspective. For me, I think the entirety of the research project or research process is really a means to strengthen relationships across stakeholder groups, particularly integrating groups and community partners who've been on the margins or excluded from these processes. So, to share a specific example, I am working with collaborators on a project called Growing Food Policy from the Ground Up. And it's a participatory action research project that's focusing on supporting urban growers of color. And we have collaborators across the cities of Buffalo and Minneapolis, community partners and academic partners, including Hopkins. And this is really a project that's co-led by this team of community university partners who've collectively informed the development and planning of this 5-year project, all the way from the grant proposal to driving the research questions, the data collection, and all of that. And so a key and I think unique component of this project is really focusing on leveraging the power of social networks in transforming urban food policy. And so on the research end, we are characterizing what local government policy networks in the city of Buffalo, Minneapolis look like, and what food system networks look like, and identifying where those disconnect across networks are, especially those affecting urban growers of color and food insecure households. And then our community partners are leading the capacity building phase of the project by developing community-led solutions and methods of preparing urban growers to engage and really emerge as leaders in their local policy network. So I think in terms of working across stakeholder groups and what this has looked like for me in the research space, it's really leveraging the research process to draw attention to the lived experiences and innovations of marginalized groups in our food system. So in this case, urban growers of color, in order to really influence and drive action and policy change.
And I just want to clarify two things. Can you talk a little bit about what's participatory action research is kind of like a catch-all term, and how does that link to the process that you were describing?
Yeah, so it's really a framework for engaging and creating a co-production process where community partners are involved in the entirety of the research process. So as I mentioned, our community partners were there from the get-go in developing the grant proposal, in informing what our questions were, what our data collection tools look like, who's involved in the data collection, and the sharing and ownership of that research. And so right now we're in the midst of, we've closed out our baseline data collection and in the midst of developing the capacity building phase. So that's kind of, I think, our hope is that this can serve as a new model for how research can really play a more active role in co-producing with our community partners in the development of that evidence that's driving policy change at the local level.
And one last clarifying or a question. You mentioned that you were trying to capture those disconnects in the network that particularly impacted urban farmers of color and food insecure households. What does that look like? What is a disconnect of network for somebody on the ground?
Yeah, great question. So we are doing what's called a social network analysis. So we've administered a survey among policy actors in the local food system in the city of Buffalo. So we're mapping out what the social network looks like among the food policy networks and at the community level, which includes urban growers. And then in addition to that, we're doing a social network analysis of households and the network of actors, whether they're friends, families, organizations that they're connected to, and how they're utilizing those networks to meet household food needs. So really characterizing what these networks of all kinds of food systems actors look like and where there are strong connections but also disconnects. Hopefully that clarifies your question.
No, I love that, because in reality, there's so many different ways that households get food, and oftentimes they're overlooked, because if you're not going to a recognized food acquisition site of a food bank or a pantry or a soup kitchen, then those other pieces of your neighborhood, your family, the other connections that you have aren't necessarily counted. And so I think that that's a great example of those instances where the traditional methods of data collection undervalue, undersee so much of what's actually going on the ground. So I love that. I think that that's great. So moving forward and continuing this conversation, I think one of the things, particularly, I think we should acknowledge the fact that the USDA Farmers Market Promotion Program grants and the Local Food Promotion Program and the Regional Food System Promotion Program grants are all due on the 16th. So if you haven't finished your grant application, there's lower participation, I think, because everybody's trying to get those out the door. But we also heard it's kind of an unprecedented time in terms of the amount of resources and energy that's going into the local regional food system. And so I'm going to ask you all, kind of recognizing that these financial resources are crucial for keeping the lights on. Can you speak to your role in your different we've pigeonholed you as different representatives of stakeholder groups, to informing how financial resources are being leveraged in the spaces you work in? And how do you see these frameworks or approaches to funding both public and philanthropic evolving and changing. So Dave, because you're our token financial funder individual, can you please speak to what this is looking like in the ground in your community and how your group is helping prepare your community for this new flood of resources?
And Libby, this is Dawn. I'm just going to break in quick.
Yeah.
Neely, there was a question for you in the chat, if you can answer it while you're not speaking about more information in our project. And Colleen, as you answer this, there was a question a while back, specifically as you answer this about if your organization has any specific priorities for the Farm Bill that beyond the resources we're already seeing you guys are targeting. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you, Dawn. So Dave, we're going to start with you, and then Colleen, we'll give you some time to think about the Farm Bill because that should never be sprung on anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. As you stated, unprecedented level of federal funding, and it's something that we've been monitoring, right? Because at Thornburg, we've got the Food and Ag program, our water program, our good government reform, and also education. But the water program and the Food and Ag program, just really watching all these funds that are coming for infrastructure needs, and working closely with a lot of our partners, our grantees. A lot of them are saying, we don't have the capacity, right, to apply for these particular funds or even manage these funds. And of course, matching funding is always an issue as well. And so Thornburg Foundation partnered with Ancorum St. Vincent, which is another foundation here in New Mexico, as well as the Santa Fe Community Foundation, to put on a pilot program that we call the Support for Pursuing Federal Funds. And this is a program that would allow our nonprofits in New Mexico to give them an opportunity to an equal footing, as you could say, to apply for these particular federal funds. And it's been really successful. Right now, we put aside $100,000 just from our side alone for food and agriculture and water applicants. And we've depleted that. And so we've gone back to our board, who's generously provided an additional 100,000 that we're going to put back into this to support all of these grantees. And we're seeing a range from needs or applications that are applying for the new Climate Smart Commodities program, to the Beginners Young Farmers and Ranchers Development Program, the ASIP ALE program. So there's just a really big need and across a big range, because in New Mexico it's we've got various different landscapes and partners doing different work. So it's really great to see that this has been helpful for them.
And are you finding that kind of a diverse array of your stakeholders are aware of these programs? Or is there even another level of education before the capacity for grant application required to bring folks to keep track of all the alphabet soup of resources that are out there?
Yeah, we partner with another group called Pivotal New Mexico, and they're able to help some of the organizations, search for grants, right, to help them tailor what their needs are, because even that process is pretty daunting. And so, those could be like a preliminary sort of check-in to see if there's anything out there, or even those funds, if they needed to, could be used to search for various grants. And yeah, so they're doing really great work.
And awesome, recognizing that we have over 100 folks that are joining us right now. If you are applying for one of these grants, what has been the most helpful in terms of helping you apply for those grants? Do you have an internal grant writer, or are you able to find resources in your community to help you kind of really put the final touches, tie a little bow on that grant to get it out the door? So would love to hear if anybody has in the chat or ideas of what additional support or help could be out there. Because I think this is really supposed to be a conversation. And so Dave is here as part of a foundation and a larger network of funders in this space. And so I think they're trying to figure out what else could they do to help folks on the ground. So if you have any ideas, folks, added that to the chat. And Eli, I'm turning to you. This is one thing that I've, as an academic, kind of tried to always balance is what is our role in terms of influencing those financial resources? Is it at a public space in the state and federal government, or is there space to engage with philanthropic private funds that are coming into these spaces? So can you speak to your role in terms of influencing and leveraging these resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on the research end, I mean, one of the things we can do is help understand where resources are being utilized and leveraged and maybe where they're not being maximized. And so, um, one of the projects that I recently had the opportunity to join is around food policy councils. And I want to lift up the work of my colleagues at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future who are leading the Food Policy Networks project, which is really focused on building the capacity of food policy councils. And so since 2013, the Food Policy Network project has been surveying food policy councils about once a year to really understand the work of food policy councils, including how financial resources are being leveraged. And so early on in the pandemic, the network administered a survey around June 2020 that included responses from almost 200 food policy councils. And what they learned was that just under 30% of respondents reported having no funding to do all of the impressive work that they were doing, particularly in response to food needs during the pandemic. And about a third had under $10,000 in terms of their budget to work with. And so the other lessons learned from this survey was just in terms of shifting in funding. And I think the pandemic, what we learned was created opportunities for reallocating funding in response to food needs. So about half of food policy councils worked more closely with government staff or elected officials to provide funding for needed food system services in response to COVID-19. So as an example, the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative was asked to co-chair the governor's food security task force in response to COVID-19, which led to the establishment of a $36 million grant program for food system infrastructure. As another example, the San Diego Food Systems Alliance in California developed an issue brief on COVID-19 and the food system and included recommendations for policymakers and funders related to food and farm workers, food businesses, farms, and food security. And so I think what we can take away is where funding is being used, but how expanding funding and staffing resources could really build out the work that food policy councils are doing in terms of pursuing more advocacy and policy work in food systems.
And it seems like putting together that ask of what's the potential, and that also seems to really segue perfectly into for Colleen is you already kind of gave a bit of an example of the relationship that you had and how that kind of brought the story from Austin to the Rockefeller Center or Rockefeller Foundation to cover a much larger geographic area. So Colleen, is there anything else that you want to expand or speak to this putting together the ask and what your role is in putting a number behind that?
Yeah, that I can definitely expand on that. And I think also within that respond to the question that Dawn raised about the Farm Bill priorities from the chat. So, I think in terms of specific Farm Bill priorities, I'm not necessarily the best person in our organization or our broader network to speak to that because I know that there are many partners that are doing federal advocacy around the Farm Bill and other food legislation, including with a lens of incorporating the Good Food Purchasing Program values in federal procurement programs like the school meals program. But I think from our organizational perspective, we really see a role for ourselves and our network for testing things out to help identify what works locally and statewide in the places where we're working to help lift up the most promising strategies for integration at the federal level. So just I think one of the exciting things about being a national organization and national network that's networking regions across the country is the ability within different locations to be nimble and to experiment and to try things out. And so I think that we've been thinking about our role is really helping to advance pilot projects and proof points that can help make the case for some of those larger scale investments federally to serve as opportunities for integration into Farm Bill advocacy. So I know I'm not like directly answering that question that was raised, but that's sort of how I think we situate ourselves within that conversation, recognizing that we have other partners who are doing some of the advocacy around specific Farm Bill priorities. So, you know, I think to expand on the example I was offering earlier, as I mentioned, you know, one of the key challenges to accelerating values-based institutional food procurement at the sort of the individual institution level is fiscal constraints. So we've taken, you know, a lot of inspiration from successful models like the Michigan local foods reimbursement for school meals and other local food incentives, alongside that feedback that we heard from Austin Independent School District and other school districts that just 25 cents per meal would be dramatically shift the ways that they can think about the institutions, school districts and institutions can prioritize and think about good food values to explore what public financial and policy mechanisms could be sort of put to work to expand the pie of resources that are available to institutions who are trying to do this work. So in general, we're thinking about you know, a values-based procurement incentive concept where institutions would apply to an incentive fund, and as part of a commitment to receiving funds, use a framework like GFPP or an equivalent program to assess their purchasing along 5 values and identify specific procurement changes that are tied to improvement along those values. So increasing their purchasing from small scale producers regionally, from producers that are prioritizing high labor standards and high animal welfare standards. And then the institutions would, you know, receive funds up front to make investments in new products, revamp sourcing strategies, and then demonstrate progress and receive additional funds as they follow through on the actions that they're planning to take to meet those values. So this is one of the things that we're interested in testing out as we, you know, try to respond to the feedback we're hearing about what the gaps are, and are, you know, trying in the process of advancing this concept in California, and hope to be able to test how it works and what additional changes to that kind of general concept might be needed to continue to advance a similar strategy in other states or federally.
So I was out of the food system game, or at the national scale, for a while, and I had some children, and then I decided to come back into it. But I'm curious, thinking about where we were 10 years ago when I was more in it, I remember there was a hesitation on the part of funders to give money to buy food. There was an interest in funders in developing new programs that would magically result in either increased supply or increased demand. And so I'm curious, Colleen, if you can speak to, has there been a shift in willingness or appetite amongst funders to put money towards buying more food, or spending more for the food that they're purchasing? And what do you think has shifted in that mindset?
Not necessarily a shift in that mindset. I mean, I can't speak to that, so like with too much specificity, but I think we're more thinking about what are the public resources that are becoming available in different places, like a budget surplus in California, and like a lot of the federal funds that are aiming to support a lot of the goals that we're talking about with trying to increase what institutions are purchasing. in alignment with, values that are sort of being also articulated through some of these funding streams. And so just thinking about opportunities to sort of to take the innovative work that's happening, that's, relying on private philanthropy dollars, and meet the need that's being expressed through some of these, like these funds that are available in different ways, in sort of at larger scales than in the past.
Okay. Shifting gears to another question, and I'm recognizing that there's, and I guess, Dawn, are there any questions from the chat box that we want to put out there?
Not questions as much as one of our participants, Ken Meter, mentioned using social network analysis to kind of build the, both visual and connectivity case for projects with some of your partners. And if any of you have used that either in helping to secure funding or grants, that would be great to hear more examples. Ken already shared a couple. And then second, Sarah Hernandez mentioned that to the heart of some of the things we're talking about, and the USDA realizing there was a need for support, the new technical assistance network they put together, specifically focused at meat and poultry processing, because that's truly come on the ground in a very fast way. So one of them is kind of highlighting things, and one is, I guess, if any of you want to remark on if you use social network studies or connectivity as a way to build your case and to strengthen your projects.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Ken. We're actually right now doing a social network analysis of Food Policy Council's relationships with partner organizations and agencies, and trying to understand what kind of network characteristics are enabling Food Policy Council's ability to move forward on certain programmatic actions or policies, and particularly those who are using racial or social equity framework. So that's something that we're interested in further exploring and using in our work. So I look forward to reading that report that you shared.
I love seeing the connections that get made in the chat box. That's always my favorite part about these webinars. And so we also respect that this webinar goes a little long, so it goes to an hour and a half versus an hour. So if folks need to leave and hop off, that's totally fine. And the recording will be available on the website soon after we finish up. And then the written summary will be available about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks after we wrap up. But so I want to make sure that we get to the question that I posed to the larger group, to the panelists first. And I'm curious where you see kind of the edge or the frontier in your particular sector or space, and what role can partnerships or networks play in helping you meet this opportunity and kind of stretch yourself beyond that edge that you've seen in the past. So I'm going to start with Eli, and then we'll kind of go to Dave and then Colleen.
Yeah, thanks, Libby. I think in the space that I work in terms of trying to align across public health planning and food systems, I think that there's a real opportunity to strengthen our monitoring and evaluation in terms of the work that we're doing across sectors in the food system. And so one example on how my colleagues and I are trying to do this is we recently published a paper called Planning for Regional Food Equity, and I'll drop a link in the chat after my remarks, and developed a tool to evaluate regional scale plans and the extent to which they are addressing different dimensions of food equity. So looking at how regional scale plans are planning for nutritional adequacy in the food system, affordability, social equity, spatial equity, and people's agency in the food system. And so this tool includes 130 indicators across these 6 different dimensions. And so I think as work in the food system space continues to grow, I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about how can we align our efforts across these sectors to really monitor and evaluate and sort of course correct as we move forward.
We did just get a question. Is that tool being used in any regions at this time? Can you speak to that?
This paper was just published in the end of 2020, and so I I'm hoping that there are some regions who are accessing, but I'll drop the link here, and folks can take a look.
And I'll also add that the data and metrics action team that is part of this project is looking to pull together metrics and indicators across different kind of categories of focus, be they kind of food-based business, labor issues, food and nutrition. And in that space, we're including metrics around equity and access across those different spaces. And then we're putting that all in one centralized location that folks can pull information from it and visualize it and engage with it in their different spaces, to try recognizing that it can be somewhat daunting to go find those different indicators and pull them for your own community, and also realizing the value of comparative. So comparing your region to another region that is somewhat similar or close, and then kind of seeing where you lie in terms of making progress in that space. And also realizing, like, if they're doing really well, can you build a connection, a sister city, that old school model that we've used in towns across the United States? There's still value in that. So if there's another city that's like yours somewhere else, can you reach out and find out what they're doing and what works in their place? Dave, I'll turn to you and the Thornburg Foundation. Where do you guys kind of see the edge of, or the possibility of the work that you're doing? And what role does partnerships or network play in, like, maybe reaching that edge and pushing it further out?
Yeah, I think for us, in philanthropy, we really rely on the networks and the partnership. Mostly, I would say, for a lot, because of the partners are the experts. These are the people who are working in the community at the grassroots level and understand the community really well. And of course, sometimes, depending on which organization, they could be the scientists that are promoting the next bit of data that's helpful in terms of making decisions. And also with philanthropy, when we look at policy, trying to reform policy, philanthropy has limitations, right? We're not allowed to do any lobbying unless you have a C4, which Thornburg doesn't participate in that. But the partners are what's critical to advancing the policy through their advocacy, and that can be done through the local food policy council, or even an organization that has a large constituency of landowners who benefit from a certain federal program. And so, that's where I see, like, our edge and that importance of having those partners and those networks to help move things forward.
And Dave, how much is seeing that as your edge influenced by your own personal history in a political space? And does that help you see that as a possibility that might not be the same for other people in your organization?
Could you rephrase that?
Well, I think the term policy can be intimidating to people. And so it's not always where their mind goes in terms of thinking about the possibility of policy. But you were in a political space in a previous iteration. And so I'm curious if that has helped you see the possibility of policy.
Yeah, there's different ways. In that previous role you're referring to is when I was working with the Senate's office. And there we did see, just a different way that, the federal programs operated, and the way that, policy was being made, how the sausage is being made. And so having that perspective is certainly important in now in this role. So it sort of gives us an advantage of understanding, I guess, a tactic on how to advance, policy for our grantees.
That makes sense. Colleen, I'm going to turn it to you to answer this question, and then I'm going to bring in the question from the chat. So Colleen, where's kind of the edge for procurement, and where do you guys see the possibility, and how do you guys plan to get there?
Yeah, so I think within the sphere that our programming is operating in, specifically in institutional food procurement, a key aim is really to shift power and decision-making authority to communities that public institutions are serving. And so transparency, including public data sharing between institutions and constituents, is a really important mechanism for that, so that communities can be effective advocates for their interests. And the edge here is really around, I think, the extent to which food supply chains are opaque, and public food procurement processes are really difficult for community partners to have insight into and influence. So we're working to try to make large scale changes in a landscape of really limited data and imperfect information, imperfect data. And so, information about where food is coming from and coming into communities through institutions really beyond the most sort of superficial layer of information can often be really difficult to obtain. And this presents challenges for institutions that are truly trying to make changes to doing business as usual through their procurement processes, and then challenges for communities that they serve to support and hold institutions accountable to spending taxpayer dollars that align with companies that are aligned with the values that they're committed to and attempting to live into. So, we just consistently see challenges around collecting good data and making it possible for all actors in a supply chain to be transparent with that information. The technologies are not there to take information from small scale farmers at the farm level and ensure that that's held with products all along the supply chain. So I think that's really where we see a significant opportunity here to figure out the systems and the technologies and the process improvements within institutions to make change more possible, get better data and better information to work from for everybody involved. And so, I think that just authentic engagement driven by transparency about where food and institution is purchasing comes from can drive innovation at the institutional level, but just with the limitations around collecting information and mechanisms for sharing it publicly, we don't yet know what the transformative potential is. And so I think we're excited to continue pushing in that space and figure out how we can sort of leverage better information to inform policy and policy campaigns. One example just of a place where we're excited is that New York City really offers a great example of a set of institutions that are sharing information publicly about their purchasing and their performance on values, and we're really looking forward to learning more from that space in that city as to how better information can foster greater collaboration and greater innovation to really be transformative within procurement, rather than sort of making incremental movements of the needle, because institutions are so unwieldy and difficult to make change within. So,
well, and it does seem like Colleen, what you're just speaking to would get, at least in part, to Elliot's point about this encouragement to work with small producers, but recognizing that the reality is that there's limited time. And so building those relationships and finding out the information that you need from those smaller scale producers to make informed business decisions is challenging. So it sounds like your organization is exploring the spaces and possibility of streamlining that transfer of information and making it easier so that that responsibility and doesn't just fall on the shoulders of every individual value-based business. But I think the other piece of the question that Elliot brought up was how do we deal with issues about speed and real-time utilization of research? So for that one, I'm going to turn to Eli about what can be done to speed up that process or improve the connection between what's happening in kind of a university research setting to those on the ground.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Elliot. Super important question. I think I'd say two things come to my mind. One, I think researchers, myself included, need to do a much better job of translating what our research means for practitioners. Why should practitioners even pay attention to the research and the findings that we end up with? And I think technology can, in part, help with that. So there are, emerging technological tools that I think we're still learning how to bring them into the food system space, but have historically been used in the engineering space. So something called agent-based modeling, where you can imagine building kind of like a sim city. And my colleagues and I have started using it in terms of building models that represent people in a given city and manipulating changes in the environment and how do those interactions between people and that space translate to health outcomes or food systems outcomes in the long run. So I think maybe more investments and work in that kind of space can help us in that real-time translation. But also leveraging networks like food policy councils, where researchers can do a better job of translating their research findings and then identifying those key networks to get the word out to practitioners on the ground.
And so it seems like we're kind of already diving into this technology space. I wonder, Dave, if you can speak to what technologies are you all encouraging your stakeholders to use or have access to help kind of streamline these processes of bringing people together?
Yeah, what we're hearing from a lot of the stakeholders and our partners is to address a couple of things. First, some of our young producers are having challenges with accessing land, and so there's online portals that would allow them to connect with property owners who are looking to lease their property, and so those are types of funding projects that we would help and support, like with the University of New Mexico, who does some of that maintenance of those online portals. Sometimes our producers are also looking for more additional online resources. And so that's another thing is, we help fund a farm and ranch resource center with our land grant university. And then also trying to help producers, connect access to the market. And this is working with our Farmers Marketing Association and also the state government and trying to create an online portal where the producers could, list their products, and then where the purchasers can come in and purchase that product. So it's still brand new territory that we're exploring, and hopefully it's going to do really well. But the other thing that we're still seeing challenges is the access to the internet, because New Mexico is a very vast state that includes rural, or what we call frontier communities. Also our tribal communities. These are some real challenges that we're trying to address as well. So, working with, some of our partners like at Rural Development, USDA, and trying to figure out what programs are available that could help, increase the internet capacity in these areas. So then that way there's an opportunity for some of those rural producers to participate in these programs.
I'm going to got one more question before we kind of really turn it to the chat box and see what folks have brewing inside. So this is for Dave and Ely. You both work or have worked or are currently working in communities that have experienced pretty severe droughts and negative impacts and threats from climate change. And I'm just curious, what successful tools are you seeing in those communities to try and mitigate the negative impacts from those climate change disruptions? And then what tools do we have, do you see in existence right now to share or communicate those lessons to communities that necessarily haven't faced those challenges yet?
I could go first. So yeah, New Mexico, we're in a desert, right? We're on fire right now. There's wildfires happening all over the state. The largest one in the country is, just about an hour north from here. And so yeah, we certainly are seeing the effects of a changing climate here in the state. One way that producers or have adapted to this change is, is more groundwater pumping. Because we aren't getting as much snowpack in the mountains anymore, we're having less surface water. And so a lot of producers are turning to, groundwater pumping, which is depleting our aquifers. So, but that is one way, right, that's sort of adapting. Drip irrigation is also promoted by USDA and RCS. But in some cases, it can be a good water conservation method. Other times it could actually use more water than intended to. Another strategy that's being implemented is fallowing fields. Agriculture uses a huge amount of water here in the state. And, we produce a lot of pecans, onions, alfalfa. We've got a dairy industry. And so looking at trying to fallow some of those alfalfa fields is one way of maybe reducing, water usage. And there's also some people in the state that are looking at, crop conversion, changing alfalfa to something else that's more drought tolerant. There are other tools out there that we haven't really explored yet, but I think that could be opportunities here. We look at indoor agriculture, right? With hydroponic, aquaponics, those could really, change the landscape here. And then agrivoltaics, that could be another opportunity as well. And so we're kind of in this exploring. New Mexico is still trying to understand and trying to adapt. And understanding what is working and what's not, but still, I think there's some other opportunities that we need to explore a little bit further.
Yeah, so related to climate pressures, my work's been completed more in the international context, but I think that there are some lessons learned that could be relevant for us here for sure. My colleagues and I did some work in India, Ghana, and Jamaica. And focusing on climate pressures and urbanization pressures that small scale farmers are experiencing. And what came out of that was we developed a framework and a process for subnational government bodies, so at the city, metro, or regional level, this 9-step process that can help local governments plan more intentionally for food systems, including considerations for extreme climate events. And so I can drop the link for that report in the chat for anyone who might be interested in that. But I think for this work, what we learned is that planners at the local government level may not necessarily be paying attention to food as explicitly as they may need to be in terms of preparing for climate challenges. And so this process is a way to get a better understanding of the local context, what the existing innovations or strategies farmers are already using, and lifting those up so that local governments can take those into consideration and maybe help support small-scale farmers in a more intentional way.
Wonderful. Thank you. I've been obsessed with Kerala since the Ministry for the Future came out and its perspective on small scale agriculture in India and its potential to influence the rest of the world. So thank you all. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, and also want to remind everybody that there will be a June webinar. You'll all receive reminders if you registered for this webinar, and it will be an opportunity for our different action teams to share what they've been working on, and get some feedback and updates on what's our next steps. But with that, I will want to open it up into the chat box. So if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, please add it there, or even unmute yourself. We did get one question in the chat box about extractive processes of research. And so what tools or approaches exist to really make sure that researchers are working better with people that are directly impacted, either folks that are experiencing food insecurity or small scale producers, or even value chain businesses or institutions that is really compensating them for their time and their contribution to the research. So if any of you have examples of what can be done to help reduce that transactional nature of those relationships.
I'd be happy to, oh, Libby, were you gonna say something? I'd be happy to kick us off with that. Thank you, that's a fantastic and really important question. I think that, you know, it's so important to, it's part of relationship building. And I think researchers from the outset have to be really intentional about building genuine, sincere relationships with community members. And as I mentioned earlier in my comments, in using a more participatory approach, participatory action research approach, where community partners, those who have been historically marginalized, to be part of that process from the outset, and really being mindful to do regular check-ins as you go along. So as an example, for our Growing Food Policy from the Ground Up project, we hold regular calls across the academic and community partners, and community partners are vetting and checking, giving feedback, and you know, adding their input throughout, from data collection and through all the way through our paper writing and all of that. So I think with starting with that intention, and I think also funders have an opportunity to make that an explicit, you know, requirement, and making sure that that compensation for participation is part of the budgeting that goes into the project. So there are many opportunities, I think, for research to sort of rethink how we engage with community members.
Colleen, is that something that your organization has had to deal with at all in terms of compensating institutional staff for the time and effort that's put into kind of capturing information and data and sharing it with you all, or is that just part of the network participation present?
So within the institutional staff, it's part of, I mean, the engagement is part of the sort of program participation and commitment, and there, you know, so I don't think that that's specifically something that there's necessarily compensation around. I think that more like thinking about how community coalitions who are, you know, advocating for institutional procurement change are being compensated is definitely an area where you know, it's really like trying to support thinking about how, you know, funders can support grassroots coalition organizing within this context is more where we've been focused and thinking about within this work.
Don, do you see any other questions or ideas bubbling up in the chat box?
I don't. I think it's been an active again, but a lot of it's just sharing resources too, which that's exactly what we wanted to catalyze. So I think it's been a good conversation, but perhaps people are wrapping up, and been a good Friday discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you all for participating in the webinar. And thank you again to the panelists. As I said, we will put together the written summary shortly and share it with everyone.